The pandemic has been hard on people worldwide, but Asian Americans are dealing with a unique challenge. Many are facing discrimination they haven't felt since World War II, as President Trump continues to refer to COVID-19 as the China virus. A new special from CBS News' Race and Culture Unit looks into this issue. It explores everything from racist attacks to how the community is looking to exercise its voting power this election. Asian Americans Battling Bias premieres this Friday. Here's a preview.
Kung flu? What are you doing in this country?
Why doesn't she go back to where she came from?
Oh my God.
A racist-filled rant against a SoCal Asian family at a restaurant in Carmel has gone viral.
Oh my God.
Since the COVID crisis began, many Asian Americans have been targeted by racial slurs.
Everything comes from China.
And even physical attacks.
We're being attacked. That's been happening throughout the country.
Kung flu,
China virus, the China plague.
Our leader is spewing out xenophobic slurs and hate. That's not okay.
Asian American hate is as old as American history.
Chinese are driven out in town after town and their homes destroyed. The Chinese became undesirable.
When I was a child, Pearl Harbor was bombed. Overnight, this country was swept up in naked, outright hatred of people who looked like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor.
No Proud Boys, no KKK.
Ugly parts of America has come into light.
Staying quiet is not an option anymore.
Asians and Black activists have always come together against a common enemy, which is obviously white supremacy and racism.
Democracy is not a product you buy, it's not a project you finish, it's a process that you engage in.
I'm ready to vote.
Early voting starts on October 17th.
Everything seems to have been shaken up. All of our voices need to be heard.
Our CBSN anchor, Elaine Quijano, is the host of Asian Americans Battling Bias. Elaine, what a delight to talk to you about this really important subject that you're diving into. So let's start off by talking about how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted Asian Americans. What did you learn?
Yeah, so as we know, this is something that has affected all Americans, but has disproportionately hit communities of color especially hard, and that includes Asian Americans. So we looked into the data, and this was my portion of the special here. If you look at this Kaiser Family Foundation report that examined and analyzed the health effects, they found that Asian patients with COVID-19 were 57% more likely to be hospitalized than white patients and 49% more likely to die. But that, of course, is part of the story. The other part of it is that on the economic front, even as millions of Americans are struggling because of the downward spiral of the economy, you found Asian American businesses have closed, hundreds of thousands of them across the country. And so we went to New York City's Chinatown and talked to a person who works at a bakery there, and he described watching as the crowds just vanished, essentially. All of the tourism business that they relied on so heavily has simply gone away. And so he has seen in his neighborhood, this is a place where he grew up, he has seen restaurants that have been open for decades close their doors. He has talked to his fellow community members there who have said they simply can't withstand the uncertainty, and they are no longer to make those ends meet, and so they're finding themselves forced to close. The thing that we know is that small businesses, Lana, are really a critical part of the engine driving the economy forward. So when you talk about this happening in communities across the country, this goes well beyond just the Asian American community. It really affects all Americans.
And we mentioned President Trump's use of the xenophobic slurs, China virus, Kung flu, and he said that the pandemic is worse than Pearl Harbor. How are all of these comments really affecting the Asian American community and getting at some of the, exposing really some of the nasty truths about racism against Asian Americans that still exist?
Yeah, so we know that bias against Asian Americans has always existed. We heard a little bit there from George Takei in the clip that you just played. What's happening now is against the backdrop of some of that rhetoric, there are increased reports of discrimination, bias, hate crimes against Asian Americans. And our Weijia Jiang actually covered this part of the story and found that there really seems to be a connection. George Takei, who played Lieutenant Sulu on Star Trek, for people who aren't familiar, he sees this direct line between the hate that is being openly expressed now and the hate and fear that existed when he was a child. So for people who don't know, his family, including him, he was imprisoned at a Japanese-American internment camp during World War II. So part of the special really examines that connection and kind of underscores that this has always been part of the United States of America, this bias against Asian Americans, but now framed within the pandemic and some of the rhetoric that we're seeing in 2020, this kind of draws that line and draws that connection.
Well, one thing that I think is particularly poignant in the special is the examination of how Asian Americans have found common ground with the Black Lives Matter movement. Talk to us a little bit about that and why it's led to this generational clash within some Asian American families.
So this is really fascinating. Nancy Chen took a look at this, where you have this intersection of young Asian Americans in particular who are finding solidarity and standing shoulder to shoulder with other activists as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. They understand the history behind this moment, that what we are seeing now in 2020, this moment of racial reckoning, has not happened here in a vacuum, that there is a long and painful history for African Americans, for Black Americans, that has led to this moment. The racial injustice, the criminal justice system and the inequalities that exist there. So while you have these young Asian Americans who are standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, there is a generational divide at times, and Nancy Chen goes into this, where others may not be aware. Some of the elders in the Asian American community might not be as familiar with the history of Black Americans in this country, about how they were brought into bondage, about how inequalities persist to this day, and injustices and inequality persist to this day as a result of that what so many call the original sin of slavery. So that is an interesting kind of nuanced look at how it is that within the Asian American community itself, you do have a diverse sort of view when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. It really does kind of fall along these generational lines oftentimes.
Good that those generational prejudices are starting to be broken down. Of course, when we're talking about the Asian American community, we're talking about an extremely diverse group of people from different countries with different languages. And when you looked at the voting habits of Asian Americans more broadly, was there anything that you learned that really surprised you, Elaine?
Yeah, so Michael George examines this part of the story, and as he points out, you have some 22 million Asian Americans in this country. And so as a voting bloc, it is now sort of just beginning to emerge. He talks about how there has been outreach on the part of both Republicans and Democrats to Asian American voters specifically because of the growing influence and the growing population, and the fact that you have pockets of Asian American voters in some really critical swing states in this country, including, Texas, Arizona, Nevada. So there is this growing attention on this group. What's interesting is, as Michael reports, though the majority of Asian American voters tend to vote Democratic, among the Vietnamese American population, that has remained a staunchly Republican sort of stronghold because for decades, this has always been the case, and Michael explains a little bit more about that background, but it is just another example of how, when we talk about these very large groups, they of course are far from a monolith. When you talk about the Asian American community in particular, the range of diversity, the fact that there are many different languages spoken in the Asian American community, it really sort of underscores just how diverse then those political views will be across the political spectrum.
All right, Elaine, thank you for joining us. And you can catch Elaine Quijano and stream Asian Americans Battling Bias right here on CBSN. The special is brought to you by CBS News' Race and Culture Unit, and it's airing this Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern.